Hey everybody, PaleoJoe here. It's been quite a while since I did a YouTube live video here, so I'm going to do one today. People have been asking me for quite a while to go ahead and do them. Well, it's wintertime now. It's starting to snow out there, so I'm thinking this is the time to go ahead and do another program. So welcome, and we're going to talk today about the Rochester Shale. Rochester Shale is a Silurian deposit right around New York, near the Rochester area. Most of the fossils that I have here are from Middleport. It's an area that about 400 million years ago was under the sea. It was a warm, shallow tropical sea down by the equator. And because it was a warm tropical sea, what usually happened was we had some very large storms, storms such as hurricanes. And when the hurricane happened, the hurricane came across the water, it churned up the water, disturbed the creatures that lived in it. In many cases, killed those creatures. But then the hurricane doesn't stay on the water; it also hits the land. When it hit the land, it created a slurry of mud and sand and debris that washed back out into the shallow lagoons and shallow tropical seas, burying all those creatures that had once lived there. Buried those creatures, and they began to turn into fossils. And now, because of some very good scientists and amateur paleontologists, they've rediscovered this area near Middleport, New York, that is about 400 million years old. And it shows some spectacular preservation of some of the animals that lived there. And again, because the hurricane happened and washed all that mud and slurry back into the ocean, what normally happened is all the creatures that lived in that area are represented in those fossil deposits. So we have seashells and corals and crinoids, trilobites, all sorts of creatures that lived in that area were buried and turned into fossils. And today I'm going to show you some of the fossils that are in my collection that I'm going to try to turn into a museum exhibit. I've got 3 museum exhibits that tour the country right now. One is the fossils of the Michigan Basin. That one talks about the fossils we have right here in the state of Michigan. Another one is Trilobite Treasures, Arthropods of the Ancient Seas. And that one actually is in storage right now, but it's going to Traverse City, Michigan in 2026. That exhibit's been touring since 2025, and it has trilobites from all over the world, all over the country. It's a really wonderful exhibit, 3,500 square feet. Then the last one I just created not that long ago is called Dino Lab. That one is the dinosaur bones that I found over the last decade or so are on display. Plus, I also have a prep lab I set up in the museum, and several times a month I come by and actually do some fossil prep right there for the people in the museum so they can see kind of what we do and how we do it. And now I'm thinking about, I've got a really wonderful collection of Rochester shale material here, and I really want to start to showcase that and get it out to the public so they can see it as well. Well, today we're going to start with some of the lesser known or creatures that are not very popular to collect. One of those is a seashell. I've got a lot of these shells. These are this is an example of some of the seashells that we find in that Rochester shale deposit. And the cool thing about this is they're seashells. They're shells just like you find on the beaches today, not the same species, not the same type. But you can imagine these creatures lived in the ocean, that those shells get washed up on the beach. These creatures would die and get buried in the mud and buried in the sediment, and they would turn into fossils. And I have a tremendous amount of fossil seashells right now in the collection. They are quite small. They're harder to see. They're not spectacular specimens. A lot of people don't really care about them, but they are really cool creatures. There are other creatures that are out there called bryozoans, and this is an example of a bryozoan forest. Let me just get it up here fairly close so you guys can see it. These are creatures that lived in the ancient tropical oceans. They had tentacles that stuck up in the water. They were filter feeders. They grabbed their food from the water. This is a specimen that came from one of the quarry operators. He is now doing some prep work for me, and he decided to let this one finally go. Again, this is a bryozoa forest. There are little indentations on this bryozoan. Each one of those indentations was a tiny little creature that was inside there. This is a really nice one, Helipora aspera. It's just a spectacular specimen, and to get this specimen out of the sediment was really kind of tough. What you have to do is you have to get it off the rock. Well, first of all, you take one piece off and set it aside. Then you clean off the next piece, pull it off the rock, set it aside, and glue it to the first one. Then you go on time after time after time. You do another one. Then you go up a little bit further, you do another one. And all the while, you're gluing these pieces back together because it doesn't look like this in the rock. Normally what happens is this stuff is buried, they're crushed, they're disarticulated, and you have to actually do this in the laboratory. Once you clean each one of those off, then you have to do it in the laboratory. Here's another bryozoan. This is a good example of another halopora right there. This one's a little bit more, a little bit more crushed. It's a little bit dimensional as well. That's another bryozoan right there, an excellent example of this creature. These bryozoans are actually animals. A lot of people think that they're plants, but they're actually animals. And these animals were filter feeders. They would actually capture the planktonic matter, the very small matter that kind of floats through the ocean. And here's just one more small bryozoan right there. Another different species. All right, let me get it up a little bit higher there. But again, just another different species. They kind of look like branches on a tree. They're bryozoans. They're actually animals. I've got lots of other really cool stuff here. One that's really kind of interesting, that's kind of interested me, is a graptolite. This is an example of a graptolite right there. These are tiny little animals. They lived in colonies like this. They also lived together, and they were sharing one exoskeleton. That whole thing right there is just one exoskeleton, and within that exoskeleton, there were a bunch of tiny little creatures that lived in that colony. They had different chambers, so they have the same skeleton but different chambers. They were also filter feeders. Most of these were floating in the ocean. They're filter feeders, but they were flowing within the water column. Again, graptolites are not the sexiest things out there, but it's really cool that we have an example of what these graptolites actually look like. I've got another one here. That's it for all those guys. Let me pull out well, I'll save this guy for later. It tells a really cool story. I'm going to get into some cystoids right now. Cystoids are animals that are related to crinoids. Crinoids are the ancient sea creatures that people like to call lilies of the sea or sea lilies. These things were actually animals. They grew attached to the bottom of the ocean floor by means of what's called a holdfast. We don't call it a root because this is not a plant. It's actually an animal. They'd attach themselves to the bottom of the ocean by using that holdfast. They had a large column made up of little tiny round discs, kind of like a stack of poker chips. On top of that stack of poker chips was a ball. That ball we call, in the case of a cystoid, we call that a theca. On top of the theca, they had brachioles. They had arms. And on those brachioles, they had little tiny tube feet, pinnules. And what this creature did is it was also a filter feeder. It would grab its food, run it down those tube feet towards the mouth. And that's how this creature would eat. They were attached to the bottom of the seafloor. And most of the time for cystoids, they were actually attached to a bryozoa colony. So these cool things you saw right here, a lot of times these cystoids are attached right to those bryozoa colonies. So let me grab one cystoid right here. This is one that's a little bit on the rarer side. This is a Callocystides jeweti. That's the Callocystides right there. This one grew on a very small stalk, again, attached to the bottom of the ocean. And the Callocystides, they had the brachioles that came up from the top of the theca. And again, this guy was a filter feeder. These guys are not very common in that deposit. They're really well sought after. If you do find one, they are really kind of rare, and people really do enjoy those. But there's another one called a Karyocrinites ornatus. The Karyocrinites are by far the most visible, most popular of the cystoids in that area. Now, this is a big one. It's going to take me a while to get it up there. Okay, this is a 5 cystoid cluster. Down at the bottom, right down here, is a bryozoa colony that these guys are attached to. And from that colony going up is the stack of what look like poker chips, those round discs. On top is a theca, and then you see those feathered arms right there. Within this area, too, there's also some more bryozoa colonies right in this area that got pushed down and crushed into the sediment as well. This one is a spectacular piece. I love this guy. And again, this shows that as the mud slurry came across, it knocked all the cystoids down in one direction and it buried them, and they started to turn into fossils. By far, the cystoids that are most common are these Karyocrinites ornatus. They are a spectacular cystoid. There was actually one cystoid found that had 11 of these attached to a bryozoa colony. That one is in somebody's collection. I believe it's in one of the quarry operators' collection. This one has got 5 beautiful little cystoids on it. So cystoids are creatures that people that people say are crinoids. They're not crinoids. They're actually cystoids. And They're actually animals. They are not plants. Now, I do have some crinoids here, and the crinoids are going to be kind of neat. But before I get into the crinoids, I've got one here that's a multi-specimen. The multi-specimens are always cool. And again, the multi-specimens happened because the mud flow that came in just kind of blew everything over, and everything that was in that ecosystem was preserved together. Now, this is a nice piece right here. This is a Keratocrinites cystoid, right over. I trying to do this the right way. This is it right there, Keratocrinites. There's actually two of them there, and there's a little bryozoan attachment point at the bottom. There's a seashell that's on there as well, and right here by my other hand, that is a crinoid. That one is Ichthyocrinus crinoid. The Ichthyocrinus was broken off. This one had a much larger stem, but it was broken off by the force of the water, and it was floating in the water column, and it got buried right next to the cystoid right here. So this is just a really nice example of a multiple piece that's got a lot of different creatures added to it. There's also a brachiopod on there as well. Okay, so that takes care of the cystoids. The crinoids are very similar. A lot of places around the country and around the world, we find large crinoid deposits. One of the deposits is down in Indiana near Crawfordsville, where again, everything was just perfect. There was a storm in the ocean. It came through. It knocked everything down. It broke them off at the stem, at the attachment point, and it buried these creatures. And it buried them very quickly. There was no time for disarticulation or scavengers to come in and eat those. Another one is in Middleport. Now, there's a couple other places around the country and around the world where these are found in larger numbers. One of those is in Iowa. So these things are found. Now, let me pick up one of these right here. This is a Dimerocrinus. And again, they are attached to the bottom of the ocean by a holdfast. The holdfast is not a root system. It's actually a part of the animal. Then it's got that tall stalk made up of discs, crinoid stem. At the top of the crinoid, they've got another ball. We call this one a calyx. Cystoids are theca. These guys are calyxes. Then they've got these large feathered arms that have the brachioles, that have the pinnules on them. And again, this thing was a filter feeder. It would capture its food and bring it down to the mouth, and that's how this creature would eat. It would pass the food particles down those pinnule till it got to the mouth. So really cool creatures. There are several other ones that are quite rare. This one right here is a Crinobrachiatus, and it's very difficult to see, but this guy actually does have the calyx there as well. The Crinobrachiatus, normally when we find these, you just find them curled up like that. You rarely find the head, you rarely find the arms, but the calyx is right here at the top. There's the calyx. And again, normally when we find these things, all you find is that curled up piece. You don't find the calyx and you don't find the arms. This one's got the calyx and the arms. This is really quite a nice piece. And this one also, there's lots of other stuff on here. There's a Phenostella bryozoan. There's other types of bryozoans on there. Again, this stuff was all buried together at one time. So a lot of times these creatures are all together buried in the bottom of the ocean. All right, let's move on to another nice one. This is a beautiful multiple plate, one of my favorites, and it's also extremely heavy. This one shows a crinoid calyx and the feathered arms all kind of splayed out together like that. This is what we call a crown. Quite rare to find crowns that are like this, that are not destroyed or damaged. This one was ripped off the stem. It floated down to the bottom of the ocean, and it was buried in that large mudslide. At the top of that thing, we actually have a trilobite. This is a Delmonites trilobite. One of the most common trilobites there. There's actually two that are very common. One is a Calamine nigrensis, and then the Delmonites lemulurus. At the bottom right here, this one is really special. The trilobites are kind of interesting. This is a complete trilobite, but he's enrolled. Trilobites had the ability to roll themselves up into a ball for protection from danger. And what the trilobites did is when they felt danger coming, they'd roll up and roll around the bottom of the ocean until the danger's over. Then they'd unfold and go about their business. The Delmonites trilobites were kind of unique. They had those longer spines, the longer genal spines and the tail spine. And when they folded up, they had these really cool spines. They were almost folded up like a clam. Very rare to find a Delmonites trilobite that's been enrolled. There's only two been found like this. This one is a ventral. I'm sorry, this one's a dorsal, and the other one that's been found is a ventral. This one again is quite rare. It's the only one found that's dorsal, and what that means is there's the head section right there that we see, and then you got the two spines, one on either side, then the spine that's from the tail in the front. He's kind of small. I wish he was a lot bigger, but this is a really nice example of a rolled up Delmonites trilobite. And right next to it, right there, this is a crino I'm going to be talking about here in a few minutes. Let me get it a little closer. That guy right there is a crinoid. That is a larger crinoid. This guy's a little baby one. This one is a oh gosh, just lost it real quick. Man, it happens sometimes as you get older. You kind of forget some of these things. This is a Dendrocrinus longodactylus, is what this one is. And here's a much larger example of it. And the reason I pulled that snail aside to talk to you guys about that one, because these are kind of interesting. Again, they're attached to the bottom of the ocean using a holdfast. Then the top of the crinoid has got the calyx. It's got those arms. But that big thing on top you see right there, this is the anal tube right there, the anal tube. Crinoids had ways to discharge their waste. In many specimens, they have this, what's called an anal tube, which is their behind where they expel the waste products. Well, there are some snails that actually would attach themselves to the anal tube and they would feed off the anal tube. They were kind of like a symbiotic creature. The snails were Platycerus. Get him over here. They're called Platycerus, and these guys are actually sometimes found still attached to the anal tubes of the crinoids. They were a symbiotic creature. The snail would attach itself to the crinoid, and they would live together as one group. I've got a couple other things that are kind of interesting. We'll talk briefly about trilobites. Trilobites are some of my favorites. They're kind of what I specialize in. Normally, we do find groupings of trilobites, in a larger area that have gotten washed into a depression, covered up in the mud, and they've turned into fossils. Well, this is one example of 4 Delmonites trilobites, all kind of mashed together on the bottom of the ocean. This is a great example of a multiple specimen species specimen, and these guys had really cool eyes. Their eyes were kind of horseshoe shaped or crescent shaped, and they were the first creatures actually on Earth that had eyes. They were kind of like a fly's eye, lots and lots of tiny little lenses. And this is one of the more common ones. This is a Delmonites limularis. The other one that's more common than this is the Calamine niagrensis. And then we also had a couple of other trilobites that were a little bit more on the rare side. One of those is called an Arctoneris. It's one of the largest trilobites that comes out of that quarry. It's very highly sought after. People love the Arctoneris trilobites. They're the detail on these guys is spectacular. They've got little tubercles all over the body section. They're just a beautiful trilobite. They're very rare and they're very sought after. The rarer they are is when they're very large. That's when they're the rarest. And I've got one kind of hiding back here. I got to bring him out. If you give me just a second, I'll get him. This is a beautiful little trilobite. It's an Arctoneris boltoni, and there he is right there. These guys, again, are some of the most sought-after trilobites coming out of that quarry. Most of the time, these guys average about 3 or 4 inches. This one is 6 inches and 15 sixteenths, almost 7 inches long. They're not very, they come out, they're fairly flat. Because of the compression of the mud, they are kind of flat. And these guys, during life, they were kind of fairly flat as well. Some are more bulbous. This guy also has the eyes that are crescent shaped, kind of like a fly's eye with all the little lenses in it, but his body is completely covered by all these little tiny tubercles, these little tiny bumps. I'm going to get this as close as I can, and maybe you guys can see them all. There they are on the tail section, the pygidium, also on the body section right there, and there's the head section. And again, you see just lots of little tubercles all over the creature. Trilobites are kind of my specialty. That's what I love to collect. These guys really are a neat creature. But again, during the Silurian period, at least in this area near Rochester, most of New York was underwater at that time. And as the storms came in off the water, the hurricanes would churn up the water. They'd bury all this stuff. in a really cool slurry, and then they would start to turn into fossils, start the fossilization process. Takes a long time. I don't want to get into the fossilization process, but they all turn into fossils. So basically, in Middleport, New York, you have everything that was in that ecosystem is all buried together, and we can learn so much about that particular ecosystem, from seashells to corals to crinoids to bryozoans, trilobites. All the things that lived in that ocean at that time we can find there. And one of the other ones that's really kind of cool is the brittle stars. This is a starfish right here. It's a brittle star called a protaster. And in this case, you can see the storm is coming in from a certain direction. Pretty much all the arms are pointed in one direction. This one arm here must have gotten stuck on something in the water, in the mud, and it kind of stayed in that one location. And as the surge came across this creature, it forced all the other arms to go on that one direction. In many cases, you'll see a lot of these fossils are all going in the same direction. Again, the mud flows came in off the land would just kind of bowl everything over in one direction. So everything's moving off in one direction. Many of the cystoids, again, like that 5 cystoid piece, all in one direction. A lot of times the trilobites are found facing in the same direction, especially the delmonites. You can imagine if these guys died and sank to the bottom of the ocean, they're very hydrodynamic. They're designed to be able to move through the water easily. If they weren't, they'd burn up so much energy trying to swim that they'd burn up too much energy and not make it. So these guys are very hydrodynamic. They could easily swim through the water. And because of that, when they died, they sink to the bottom of the ocean. Now, because of the current and the slurry coming through, it will tumble them until they orient themselves to the path of least resistance, which means their nose is pointing back into the current. Because they're hydrodynamic, the water would easily flow over top of them and bury them. If they didn't, they would continue to tumble until they oriented themselves to the path of least resistance, which means their nose is pointing back into the current. So really wonderful. Many times, fossils tell us stories. Fossils can tell us all kinds of stories, and in Middleport, New York, it tells us a great story. So when you're looking at a fossil, especially if you find it out in the field somewhere, you find it in the rock, that fossil will tell you a certain story. So anyway, that's just a quick, well, not that quick, review of the area of Middleport, New York, the Silurian Shale there, and some of the specimens that come out of there. Again, I'm going to attempt to build an exhibit around all these things. I've got much more than what you saw here. These are some of the better specimens. And once I get that exhibit built, I'm going to start touring that to museums around the country, probably in New York, because most of these are New York creatures. But if we're talking about fossils, we're talking about entire ecosystems, we're talking about all these different creatures together, it'll make a really cool exhibit. I want to thank you all for taking the time to watch this thing. And hopefully it gets you excited about fossils, get you want to get out there and find fossils of your own. Now that wintertime is here, I'm going to start doing a few more of these programs. I'm going to do one specifically on crinoids, do one specifically on trilobites, and specifically on some of the fauna that we find fossilized around the world. Yeah, I'm going to do a couple on dinosaurs too, now that wintertime is here. I want to thank you all for stopping and checking this thing out. Let me know if there's something special you want to see. Again, this is PaleoJoe signing off. You guys have a great winter, and I'll be back out in the fields come spring. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.